Turning now to the presidential race, President Trump will officially accept his nomination for re-election to close out the Republican National Convention tonight. He'll wrap up the convention from the south lawn of the White House to a crowd of more than 1,000 people. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Ivanka Trump, Rudy Giuliani, and other top Republicans are also on the lineup for tonight. Last night, Vice President Mike Pence attacked Joe Biden in his speech while addressing Hurricane Laura, the coronavirus pandemic, and racial injustice in our country. Our Skylar Henry has more from Washington.
You won't be safe in Joe Biden's America.
Amid ongoing protests for racial justice, Vice President Pence argued the nation would be less safe with Joe Biden as president and better off with 4 more years of President Trump.
Too many heroes have died defending our freedom to see Americans strike each other down. We will have law and order on the streets of this country.
The vice president also defended the president's response to the coronavirus pandemic on the third night of the Republican National Convention, as other speakers reached out to female voters.
I have a 9-month-old daughter. She's a beautiful, sweet little girl. And I choose to work for this president for her.
A woman in a leadership role can still seem novel. Not so for President Trump.
Tonight's lineup includes top GOP lawmakers in both the House and the Senate, as well as the president's daughter, Ivanka Trump. Alice Johnson, the former inmate whose life sentence the president commuted at the urging of Kim Kardashian West, will also speak.
He had the ability to save my life from life in prison, yes. He is the one who released me from that terrible sentence.
More than 1,000 guests are expected on the South Lawn for the president's speech, as he officially accepts the party's nomination for a second term.
I hope that he also looks to our future and talks about bringing this nation together.
Democratic vice presidential nominee Kamala Harris will deliver a pre-buttal this afternoon, blasting the president's record on the coronavirus and racial injustice. Skylar Henry, CBS News, Washington.
For more on this, I want to bring in CBS News Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett. Major, always great to be chatting with you. So let's look forward to tonight. What kind of voters are Republicans really trying to appeal to? And did Pence have a specific role in targeting one of those subsections last night?
Well, right now the president is behind in many battleground states because he has lost traction among independents who voted for him in 2016 and suburban Republicans. This shows up repeatedly in internal Trump campaign polling and Republican National Committee polling. It's also visible in all sorts of public data as well. The numbers are not lying. The numbers are not deceiving us. We know what the numbers are. The president has lost ground in key areas. And this talk about you will not be safe in Joe Biden's America is, by the calculus of the Trump campaign, designed to enlist the support of those independents and suburban voters who have yet to be convinced about President Trump. It is not altogether the most optimistic message. It is, are you afraid? Do you feel anxiety? Do you feel uneasiness about what you see on television in terms of the protests and some of the violence associated with them? And if you do, then you must come to President Trump for re-election. That is the pitch, and it has been repeated every single night of this convention. And that is also being paralleled by prominent athletes boycotting games, saying no, there needs to be action, there needs to be legislative response at the local, state, and federal level that hasn't occurred, that these deeper issues of justice are not being addressed. They are real, and the protests are not off base. They are about a better future for America, and those two things are clashing in full public view. And what has been interesting this week is to see how much the emphasis of the Republican Party has been about law and order and being afraid of what they portray as protests and violence. They often commingle them, even though they're not in almost all instances. And then this Democratic response that, wait a minute, these issues of justice are real and they have to be dealt with, and they're not going away, that this isn't something that you can sloganeer in terms of a re-election campaign. That's essentially where we are. You asked about Vice President Pence. One important point. Of course, his number one mission was to support the president and be the top advocate for his re-election. Every vice president does that. But this vice president finds himself in an interesting position. The incumbent president for whom he works is trailing and is not a lead pipe cinch to win re-election. What does that mean? that means the effort within what remains of the Republican Party, if Donald Trump loses, falls to several competitors, chief among them Vice President Mike Pence, also Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley, Tom Cotton, who's going to speak tonight, and possibly others, Kristi Noem, the South Dakota governor who spoke last night. All of them are competing to be that next person if, in fact, Donald Trump loses, or his natural successor if he wins a second term. So one of the side motivations for Mike Pence last night was to put himself, if possible, at the front of that list of the next behind Donald Trump whenever that time comes.
Interesting. It was also interesting for me, Major, hearing Pence's speech last night, and as you mentioned, this law and order and sort of the threat that they said would underlie a Biden-Harris executive. With the contrast that the Republicans were making coming out of the DNC, that they thought that the Democrats had been overly negative, pessimistic, and that this was going to be an optimistic view of the country. How do you think Pence measured up to what we expected, at least according to the Republicans, heading into that speech?
Look, every speech has component parts of both. There's always a warning about what you do if you change course, if you're the incumbent party seeking re-election. Every speech like this has a component of, don't do this, it's dangerous, you're taking a big risk. What was more emphasized is about the risk to your own personal safety if you choose a Biden-Harris ticket from the Republicans. And that is different. And it also raises a fundamental question. If you are the incumbent party, and the country is at odds, and there is division in the streets, and there is some component of discord, how much are you responsible for that? And this is going to be a part of the debate in this country leading up to Election Day, particularly in those suburbs and among those independents. Whose fault is this? There are plenty on the protest side who say the president is, if not indifferent to these underlying issues, he doesn't wrestle with them in any public way. And he doesn't speak a language that talks to unity or reconciling the country to these issues that are painful and historic. So there is a calculation Republicans have. This is always going to be a winner. Law and order always wins. Well, maybe we're at a turning point in this country where law and order is viewed in a different way, and there's an answer back. Yes, we want order, but we want laws to be upheld, and we want justice for all in a way that it's not being carried out now. That is going to be the conversation of the next 2.5 months. And the Republican calculus is an old and long-standing one. It's happened before. It's a very familiar playbook. We will find out in this country if it is a playbook that is still successful.
Yeah, you know, we heard from the First Lady a little bit more of that message. I think we heard almost none of that coming from the Vice President. The emphasis, as you say, was really on that idea of taking back the streets, law and order, preventing anarchy. The president speaking tonight is going to speak before a crowd of more than 1,000 individuals there at the White House. The White House, by the way, does say that all of them will be tested for COVID-19. I'm wondering, Major, if you think that he will focus more on that optimistic viewpoint that racial progress can be made with an acknowledgement of the very serious issues that our country faces, or if he will skew more towards the vice president's speech tonight in terms of tone.
The president will probably do a little bit of both. Based on what we've been told, he'll do a little bit of both. But the president's orientation to these underlying racial issues is always the same. It's been the same throughout his presidency. Jobs solve almost everything. Economic growth solves almost everything. And that really is all he ever says about this, other than I'm in favor of justice, I'm opposed to violence, and I'm okay with peaceful protesters, even though actions of his administration, particularly running them out of Lafayette Square so he could pose with a Bible in front of St. John's Church, certainly run counter to that rhetoric. But the president will say, I created jobs before, I'll create them again, and if you're worried about racial division in this country, the Biden-Harris ticket will only make it worse because they, and this is the words of the president and so many Republicans this week, they meaning the Democrats and their two nominees, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, thrive on identity politics, which our Republicans argue is about dividing people, not uniting them, and blaming America for a lot of these things that Republicans believe America should not be blamed for, that there was no great original sin. If there was an original sin of slavery, we've dealt with it as best we can, and we're trying to evolve. And they don't want a lengthy discussion about what the after effects and the long-term legacy of slavery has been in this country, which is precisely the conversation that civil rights advocates and anti-racist advocates want the country to have. They believe that is a natural evolution. Now that we have for decades removed all of the segregationist laws, we need to have a deeper conversation about the psychological effect of those laws and unconscious bias and things that are still not equal and are assumed to be unequal just because they always have been so. And that is a conversation Republicans have said over and over this week is not only unwelcome, it's intellectually and politically invalid. They want to cancel that conversation even as they accuse the left, Vice President Biden, Kamala Harris, of living within and trying to foist on America, in their words, not mine, a cancel culture. So this is not just a debate about law and order. Republicans want this to be a debate about the cultural definition of America. That's also on the ballot.
Well, Major, you have covered multiple presidential campaigns. We've spoken ad nauseum about how the pandemic has changed these campaigns. But I'm wondering if we can even just set that aside and look at maybe a more holistic picture of this election. What really stands out to you as something that needs to go down in the history books when they look at the 2020 election?
That Donald Trump is, in every way, shape, and form, a unique political figure in American history. Unique in his tone, unique in his rhetoric, unique in his style, unique in his approach to the office itself. And he said he would be. And he said when he ran, the norms and established methods of the White House and Washington need to be turned over, and I will turn them over. And clearly he has done that. In many instances, to the horror of Democrats and others who believe that these institutions and these norms are worth upholding and had been respected by both parties, and to respect them isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of fidelity to what America is all about. That's a kind of conversation we haven't had in a presidential campaign in my lifetime, meaning, will the institutions of our country, as we've always understood them, survive? That is not a sidecar conversation in this campaign. It's right in the dead center of it. The institutions of America, the things we've always believed in, relied upon, and understood to be durable, in the minds of Democrats, and certainly in their rhetoric, are in jeopardy. They are in peril. When Joe Biden said last week, democracy is on the ballot, that's what he was driving at. That's the kind of conversation, the kind of backdrop to a presidential election I've never seen before. I've seen lots of conversations about, was it right to go invade Iraq? Was it right to have this tax cut? What's the best health care plan? What do you want to do about immigration? Policy differences, and then they would be communicated as differences in ideological and fundamental values of the two parties. But I've never seen a conversation about, will our institutions survive? Yes or no? That is part of what this campaign is about, and the country is going to have to render a verdict on that very question when it renders a verdict between Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
You know, honestly, the last time that was the question on the ballot, arguably Lincoln was also on the ballot. Major Garrett, thank you.
No doubt. Not in my lifetime. That's all. The only point I was making.
Well, we know you don't stretch back that long. You are venerated, sir, but you're much younger than that.